Much for joining us again on the program. Every time we talk to you, it's because there has been, it seems, another killing of a black man by police in America. And in the case of Minneapolis, for a traffic stop for having air freshener in the back of his car. Is it just the rules around traffic stops that just need totally overhauling here?
Well, thanks again for having me on. The big thing that people need to recognize is that whether or not it's an air freshener, like in Minnesota, whether or not it's dark windows or the inability for law enforcement to see a temporary tag, these are oftentimes used as justification to pull over vehicles, disproportionately pulling over people of color, disproportionately pulling over black people, disproportionately running their license, and then disproportionately using force against them. So whether we're talking about Virginia, Minnesota, California, or New York, these are the patterns that we continuously see play out. And look, I can tell you, as a black man in America, I've been pulled over for having dark tinted windows. I've been pulled over for having things hanging from my rearview mirror. And these are the sort of experiences that people have in the United States of America.
Yeah, that phrase, driving with black, is a real thing in this country. There is, what struck me watching that body camera footage from Virginia was the degree to which the police officers were kind of amped up from the moment they left their car. They had their guns out, they had the pepper spray out, they're yelling and screaming at this Army lieutenant. And what can be done within police departments to have some kind of retribution, not just for the officers, but perhaps for the department as a whole, that local department as a whole?
So, of course, what we see with the Army lieutenant is that we cannot outclass racism. Not only did the officer try to demote him in a sense, more or less say what his rank is, and then the lieutenant had to say, I'm a lieutenant. But part of the other thing that stood out to me was what the officer said following the incident as they're standing at the rear of the car. He said, this will not affect me one way or the other. Well, obviously, we know months later, he has been fired since the video evidence has surfaced, but he will probably not face any sort of civil culpability. So this $1 million lawsuit that's been filed by the lieutenant will probably eventually be paid out. Similar to, there will be a multi-million-dollar lawsuit for the death of what just happened outside of Minneapolis in Minnesota, and taxpayers are on the hook for this. This is the reason why I've been recommending that we have police department insurance policies and also police officer individual liability insurance to put them on par with what we see in healthcare and other facets of life. And then all of a sudden, because I want people to pay attention to all of these incidents, what happened to the lieutenant? If you actually look at all angles, the younger officer actually looked at the older officer a bit surprised at first, but he went along with it. With the death of George Floyd, what we saw in that murder was another officer saying maybe we should roll him on his side. And what we saw in what just happened with Mr. Wright, the 20-year-old killed in Minnesota, we saw other officers after that incident saying, oh, geez, this just happened. All of those officers, though, stood by and let it happen. And see, that's the problem. There's a lack of accountability. I think that insurance, as well as dealing with qualified immunity and the Law Enforcement Bill of Rights, will help to address that.
I think the important point you make, though, is that we saw it. We are seeing it more now because these officers are wearing body cams, and also we saw the lieutenant set his own mobile phone on the dash, so we got his perspective of it as well.
I mean, without a doubt, look, we know that video evidence is extremely important for holding officers accountable. And part of what made the officers upset in the lieutenant's case is that he turned on his hazard lights. He went to a place that is well lit. That is something that black people and people of color are told in America all the time, as well as women. Go to a well lit place. I want people to think about what would happen if we did not have video evidence. What would happen if he had have stopped in a dark place? Maybe would have turned out like Jonathan Ferrell. Maybe it would have turned out like some of these other incidents that we know that have happened. And it's very clear that police reform in America is simply in name alone. Reform is not enough. We need transformation to actually see things happen. And look, there are tons of good officers that want to see that as well. But oftentimes it is difficult to reform culture. What we have to do is to play up the structure and deal with the policies that are in place that allow for officers to be unchecked, not just fired, but held accountable, not just individual officers, but the police departments as well, and not simply taxpayers.
Rashawn Ray, good to talk to you again. Thank you very much indeed. And as we say, a curfew in place this evening in Minneapolis. We will keep our eyes across that.
Yeah, and you know one heartbreaking thing, Christian, as he was being pulled over, Daunte Wright, the young man who was killed in Minneapolis, called his mum to tell her that he was being stopped by the police, because every young black man knows that there is a risk when you are stopped by the police in this country.